The battle of wizards and warriors continues with iron swords. The evil wizard Malkill will take the shape of the earth, wind, water, and fire. Farewell! The fate of the world is in your hands!
You're listening to the Piercing Wizard podcast, and I'm your host, Ryan Willett. I'm a professional body piercer with 20 years experience. I travel around the world teaching technique and safety classes, and I'm a member of the Association of Professional Piercers. Listen in as I talk to my friends and colleagues about our industry so we can all stay sharp.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the Piercing Wizard podcast. I'm your host, Lola Slider, and joining me this week once again is Ryan Willett.
Heyo.
We are going to be talking about jewellery, or as it's spelled in the UK, jewellery. We're going to be talking a little bit about dealing with companies where you have issues around quality control. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about the logic and theory that goes behind size selection for initial piercing lengths and gauges. I don't know about you, Ryan, but personally, I feel that jewellery companies can do no wrong, and I am under no duress to say that whatsoever. I think they're all doing a bang-up job, and we should all just be grateful.
Is it like that Simpsons episode with Tom Jones where Smithers has the gun in his
Help
back?
me.
And he's like, just smile and wave.
Yep.
Yeah. The thing about it is we are body piercers, and some body piercers have maybe a foot in the jewelry manufacturer realm, but most body piercers do not have the means to produce their own jewelry. So we kind of pick our favorites, or we pick the people that we can work well with, and then we just hope that something doesn't go disastrously wrong with that supply chain. Thanks for joining us on that.
So this is a subject that made both of our bumholes tighten a little bit, because obviously as piercers we're dependent on our companies to help keep us in business, but at the same time navigating and discussing errors in quality control, design flaws, just general product inconsistency. These are things that we might have to deal with in our careers as piercers, and it can be awkward. And we kind of chatted about it a little bit, and we kind of worked out that there are two different sides to this, at least. There's the way that we interact with larger scaled up companies, and there are the ways that we interact with smaller, more independent companies. And we shouldn't expect the standards to be different for either, but the approach that we might need to take in some instances may need to be slightly different. Ryan's going to be speaking to us in tongues. Wait, about tongues. Yeah.
Well, okay, so that was a good segue, by the way.
You just thought of it.
Thank you. I have a new Patreon video about paired tongue piercings. I did a traditional centerline tongue piercing video late last year, but I had the opportunity to do some paired tongue piercings, which I hardly ever do. It's been years since I've done them, so I got to record a set. They came out really well. I was really proud of them, and I have a couple of my tips and tricks to show. So that's available now at patreon.com/RyanPBA on the Archmage tier. And I would love you to check it out if you're interested.
Now, if you aren't a subscriber to Ryan's Patreon, you still cannot escape, because Ryan will also be doing some instructing.
Yeah, so I'm going to be doing two classes upcoming. I'm going to be doing a class in Quebec, Canada, and that's available for registration now at ryanpba.com, but you don't have very long to register because that's coming up on Sunday, March 16th. So if you're interested, if you're in the general Montreal area, I'll be showing a couple different demonstrations related to advanced bevel theory, and I'm going to be doing a 2025 update to my doth piercing class, which I'm really happy with. I got to do that when I was out in Indianapolis. So I'll be doing that again just outside of Montreal, Quebec, Canada on Sunday, March 16th. So if you're interested, you can go ahead and sign up. And I'm also going to be doing one of my online Introduction to Bevel Theory webinars. So I get asked about that pretty frequently, but I usually only have time to fit it in once or maybe twice in a year. So I'm going to be doing one of those on Sunday, March 23rd. I'm also doing a Patreon discount. So if you're already a subscriber at patreon.com/RyanPBA, I'm going to give you a $15 discount on that webinar if you're interested. So if you're looking into any of those classes, you can go to my website, ryanpba.com. You can get all the info about them. You can get registered, and I'd love to have you attend.
I do make little tongue-in-cheek comments here and there, but I think it's wonderful that you're making this stuff so accessible in lots of different formats for people. There was nothing like that when I was starting out, so super cool.
Me neither. So I had to go through this old copy of Grey's Anatomy and just hope that I would find an anatomical diagram.
I prefer House MD myself.
I didn't really have a lot of opportunities to learn through class structure until I started going to conference.
Yeah. So getting into the meat of today's episode, we are going to try our very best to not put our feet in our mouths. We're going to be talking a little bit about jewellery companies and quality control and how we can bring certain issues to the attention of companies in a respectful way. And we're also going to be talking a little bit as well about some of the theory and thought that goes into determining the length and gauge and just initial size of the piercings that we do, and what some of the rationale is that goes into that, because a lot of it is just information that's passed down, and a lot of people aren't really understanding the fundamentals behind those choices. So what do you want to start with today?
Well, so we have a few more questions from our submissions form. So we did a few episodes previously where we just did all submitted questions. So that's what we're going to be going back to. These ones have a little bit more that we can sink our fangs into. So we're gonna talk about it in a little bit of a longer fashion. But the first question is, when should you reach out to a jewelry company if you have issues with some of their jewelry? Things like design flaws, threadless pins breaking easily, sizes needed aren't offered. Is there a good way to go about this? Are some things even worth mentioning? I know that we've both had our interactions with jewelry companies over the years, and some of them have been positive and some of them have been a little bit more on the negative side. Not all companies, we had to learn this the hard way, not all companies want your feedback or your input. Sometimes they do welcome that, sometimes they do not. So it's a fine line you have to walk, because as body piercers, the majority of us are not manufacturing our own jewelry. We are reliant on these companies. We're reliant on the supply chain to have the things that we need to be able to perform the job that we perform. So how do you want to get into this?
Well, this subject kind of broke off into two categories. We talk a little bit about what we're going to discuss beforehand, just to get a rough idea. And we both kind of came to the same conclusion that there's the element of dealing with larger companies, scaled up companies, and also the issues that you can have dealing with very small independent manufacturers that are just starting out. And we should expect the same standards from both if ultimately they're ending up in our clients. But the way that we might interact with them and some of the reasoning behind the interactions might slightly differ as well. So what do you want to talk about first? Should we talk about the kind of larger companies or the smaller companies?
Well, before we kind of like move into one direction, I also just want to acknowledge our privilege, because we've both had the opportunity to talk face to face with a lot of these makers, whether it's like the smaller like craft makers or like the larger like production scale makers. We've got to interact with a lot of them at different conferences. So sometimes it's more of a personal connection, because we can actually talk to a person face to face. So my comfort zone is probably going to be based on like my previous experience with their company. Like, do I order from them or not? Have I actually met them in person or not? I think sometimes I feel a little bit more comfortable talking to the larger scale companies, because maybe I've worked with them as a client for years. Sometimes with the smaller vendors, I might not have worked with them yet. I might not be very familiar with their lines. And if I don't know them personally, it can sometimes be a little bit more challenging for me to bring questions or ideas to them. So what's your comfort zone for when you want to bring input to a company?
So for me, again, it depends on the scale of the company. So say that it's a smaller company. There are a couple of different things to consider. A big concern of mine, being based in the UK, is things like return, repair, that kind of thing, making sure that I understand what their policies are before getting in any of their stock. But in terms of how to interact with them, I think something that's quite important, and this is very important amongst our local community, wherever we're located, our local manufacturers that are just starting up, that are just making, is not to kind of give them a pass on quality just because we're proud of what they're doing. And what I mean by that is we all know, well, most of us will know or be familiar with someone in our community that's starting up as a jewellery maker, right? Which takes an enormous amount of skill and time and courage, and I have enormous respect for. But at the same time, there are instances where you'll look at a piece that doesn't appear, to my eyes, just as someone who's not an expert in jewellery manufacture, to not be entirely suitable for a client's body, just in terms of the overall quality of the piece. Maybe it's rough on the underside, for example, something like that, something that we can all kind of picture. And it makes me think someone should tell them that. Like someone that's working with that brand should be telling them that. They shouldn't just be saying, oh my God, you're so amazing. I'm so, like what you're doing is fantastic. Because to me, that's actually more disingenuous. Because if they want your company to do well and your small business to flourish, then what they should be doing is being honest with you. And I've had at least 2 companies that I can think of in my head that were just small independent makers. And both of them I've started out with very early on in their manufacturing process, and I've had samples and things, and I've reached out to them and I've said, hey, listen, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but I'm looking at this item here and I can't even use this in a healed client. This could cause injury. I'm not saying it to be hurtful. I'm saying it because I'd rather say it to you privately. Other people are going to be talking about this and they won't tell you. And both of those companies hugely stepped things up and said thanks so much for the feedback and actually made the changes. So sometimes I think when you're dealing with more of a startup, that it is cruel to be kind a little bit.
I think it can be kind of a disservice when you're supportive beyond the realm of reason.
Right.
Like if it's someone that you want to see succeed, someone, maybe a friend or someone who you feel represents your community, like, yes, like support them, like buy their jewelry, things like that. But if you look at their jewelry with that piercer's eye and you say, I don't love this. I don't love this gem setting. I don't like the pins you're putting on your jewelry. It's a bad connection point, or it breaks, or there's a bulge or a polish issue or something. You don't want to still just like clap and applaud and be like, you're perfect, this is amazing. You can like the post, you can share the post, you can juice them up a little bit, but send them that private message and be like, hey, I just wanted to give a little bit of input. Are you receptive to that? I wanted to maybe just tell you some thoughts on the jewelry that I got in from you, because like they're going to want to see their company grow and succeed. And they're going to want to hear that feedback, because the more people that like their jewelry and like the quality and are happy with the results they get, the more people will be buying it and the stronger their company will be. So I think it can maybe in a way limit the potential growth or success when you just blindly support people instead of saying like, you're doing great, but I think you can do a little bit better. Like I think that people need to hear some of that encouraging, constructive criticism.
Right. I think that, and I'm not suggesting that you reach out to people that haven't asked your fucking opinion, and that you're not interested in supporting.
That's something that I want to talk about quite a bit as we get into it.
I'm not saying that that's necessarily something that you should be doing, but the people that give you those bits of helpful, critical, but maybe negative feedback, those people really fucking care. Like those people really care about the success of your business because they're taking the time to highlight specific issues to you. They're not just nodding and smiling and saying good job, because at the end of the day, that's kind of patronizing. Like you're a grown up and you're trying to profit off of something, so you should want to be putting out a good, safe, consistent products if you're wanting to have a future in that line of work. So I think that in terms of how we engage with the smaller makers in our community, yes, it's incredibly important to uplift them and promote them and give them all of the praise that's due, but that doesn't mean that we should overlook things that we wouldn't accept from a larger company, because the bottom line has to be safety, client satisfaction. I'm not going to sell anything to a client, no matter who it is that I've bought it from, that I'm not happy meets a certain standard. So I think that if you are that kind of artist, that you're going to be putting your work out there, which is incredibly brave as a jeweler to be making your work and putting it out there, you have to have a thick enough skin to be told when something isn't working. That's what I think about it anyway. And I certainly think that we should be kind in our critiques, because it's a lot easier to criticize than it is to actually make something. But at the end of the day, if these people are wanting your money, if they're wanting you to buy a product, you have to have a comfortable enough relationship to say, the setting of this or the finish on this, or, something about the overall quality is not what I would feel comfortable letting leave my studio. And I think that's how those businesses get stronger.
Yeah, I agree with all that. But I think it's also really important for us to talk about the difference between constructive and destructive criticism. Like, not all companies are going to welcome critiques with open arms. Like, some of them will have a mechanism for it, a portal on their website. They might tell you, like, when you make an order, like, hey, I would love to hear input or feedback from it. But you want to be respectful, and you want to be gentle in a way, not to the point where you're coddling people, but you want to realize that nobody likes to just have negative input thrown at them unexpectedly. Like, you have to think about yourself as a body piercer, like you listening, think about you as a body piercer, or think about whatever your job might be if you're not within the piercing world. Sometimes you can get those polite emails that say, hey, I saw this and I think that it could maybe be a little bit improved, and maybe here's an idea, or hey, are you interested in maybe having a conversation about it? The big flip side to that is when you just get those angry emails about, like, I hate this, I don't like this. Like, I've gotten deconstructive, non-constructive criticism before, and it really just puts me on guard. It makes me kind of close myself off to maybe some of the genuine, like, positive points of that criticism because of the delivery of it. So sometimes you really have to think about the way you're going to deliver your constructive criticism, and it should always start with something along the lines of, hey, are you open to a chat? Are you open to some feedback? Are you open to some input? It should not just be, here's a list of 10 things you're doing wrong and I want you to fix it. I don't think that that's going to be well received by someone unless you have a pretty personal relationship with them.
Yeah, think about what your intention is when you're sending the criticism. Is your intention actually to improve the product and help uplift the business, or are you just being a tool?
Right. Yeah. The whole, like, troll kind of mentality online, if you want to try to troll somebody, like, it is not constructive criticism if it's in like a thread, if it's in like a comment thread on social media, because people might not understand the positive parts of your criticism, and they might try to jump on top of that in like a trolling kind of way. And sometimes it can really hurt the feelings of these craftspeople that are making jewelry, and they might really be interested in hearing that input. But when it comes at them in a barrage, especially through a platform that they weren't expecting it to come from, sometimes that can just be really hurtful, and it really closes the door when what you want is them to be open to your ideas.
And I also want to take a second as well just to acknowledge that I know we're talking right now about some product issues with smaller manufacturers, issues with consistency and overall quality and that kind of thing. I just want to point out some of the most beautiful jewelry I've ever seen in my life comes from tiny jewelry companies, from independent makers. So there's absolutely no correlation, as far as I'm concerned, between high volume, low volume, and quality. They all have their variation. We're just kind of focusing now on how to send in critique to a smaller company. I don't want to suggest that they're any more likely to need it, because again, some of the most amazing pieces that both of us have seen have come from independent manufacturers that produce in low volume. So that spectrum of quality is still there. And I think that that's also why we shouldn't make allowances and say, oh, it's fine if it's not perfect, like, because there are so many people out there who are doing perfect.
Yeah, I think the goal for any jewelry manufacturer is probably perfection, but I think you have to be honest and realistic and understand that that takes time and that takes experience. And some of the newer companies that come around, whether they're machinists that are working with titanium, whether it's craftspeople that are working with gold and precious metals, things like that, everyone will have a little bit of a learning curve. Maybe they received education or an apprenticeship or some sort of mentorship or guidance, but some of them are kind of self-taught and they're doing it as a passion project, and there's going to be kind of a journey for them. Some of the companies that I carry in the studio now, I've carried them for 20 years, and I've really seen a lot of these companies grow. I've seen a lot of flash-in-the-pan companies come and go. I've seen small companies turn into larger companies. I've seen people grow to the point where I might have seen something initially and thought like, that's not really something that I'm going to be comfortable carrying in my studio. But then time goes by and those pieces are refined and developed and worked on, partly through constructive criticism and community input and feedback. And partly just because the people making the jewelry are gaining experience and they're getting better day by day and year by year. So there is this balancing act of, yes, you want to support, but can you support in different ways? Support financially by ordering, support by maybe having conversations and talking to them about the piercer perspective, because some of the people making jewelry, some of these crafters, manufacturers, they're not body piercers. They're maybe more experienced with machining and goldsmithing, things like that. So there have been loads of jewelry vendors where I've talked to them from the piercer's perspective and been like, well, have you thought about this? Because this is how we're using it. This is how we're installing it. This is how people are wearing it. This is how people are healing while they're wearing it. All these different things, you want to take that into consideration to make the best product possible. And I've gotten some great interactions with jewelry companies because it might have been something they weren't thinking about, or they might have been developing something in a way where I wasn't thinking about it. So it's great to share those two different perspectives.
Yeah, so I think ultimately if you want to help support your local community and uplift smaller makers within your community, the best way to do that is to turn your expertise into a tool that they can use to help improve what it is that they're putting out. Because, if that's not happening, then they might not be improving, and worse, there might also be a lot more negative feedback out there that they're not privy to, that's being, nobody wants to be talked about instead of to. So I think if you have something to say it to the person wherever possible instead of saying it to someone else.
Yeah, I have learned I've learned a lot of communication lessons the hard way. Several points in my career where I thought like, obviously this person's going to want me to tell them how to do their thing better, and it's just been a complete disaster. I know that you've had some experiences.
The hell you say.
Like basically kind of lighting your own bridge on fire. If there's anybody out there who knows what the letter was, we can all have a chuckle about it, but to give you like a very brief explanation, I don't even remember how long ago it was. It had to have been like probably 15 years ago at this point. There was a jewelry vendor, maybe actually multiple jewelry vendors, who had a business practice that some brick and mortar piercing studios thought wasn't necessarily a benefit to them. And they thought that maybe a tweak to those vendor policies could be more beneficial to brick and mortar piercing studios and the piercing industry on a whole. So a few piercers, myself included, thought that it would be a good idea to collectively write a letter and attach our names to it and give it along to these vendors and kind of give them a very forceful, like, this is what you're doing wrong and this is what we want you to do to fix it. And it was such a foolhardy thing to do, to think that we could just, I don't even know, like these jewelry companies were going to like bow at our feet and be like, oh, we're so sorry that we did something that you didn't think was perfect. And it was really bad. It was bad for us, and it was probably bad for the jewelry vendors as an experience and as a community experience. I think a lot of us learned from it, and I think that might be part of why I want to communicate in a certain way today. I want to make sure that the people I want to give input and feedback to are open to it. before I open my mouth, because as I said, I'm very reliant on these companies. And if there was a company who maybe got offended by unrequested feedback, unrequested criticism, some of these people can make the decision to drop you as a client. It's not unheard of. It has happened in the past. And I don't want to be one of those studios that has a door closed on them for part of that supply chain.
So as we kind of segue into the floors made of lava conversation about larger production jewelry companies that we use, I think the way, as you bring up, the way that we communicate and engage with them, it is a little bit more delicate at times, a bit more tentative, because there's more to lose, there's more at stake, there's more access. And I think especially when you're dealing with a company that's been around a long time, we also have to think about things like staying power. You know, like there is security in ordering from a company that's been around for a long time. You know, it's not, as you say, flash in the pan. So there is quite a lot to lose. And what I would say is these larger companies, and I'm going to be very non-specific here, they have reputations. You know, each will have their own reputation. If you don't know what it is, colleagues will be happy to tell you. Believe the reputation. That's all I'm going to say is whatever they tell you, good, bad, just believe it. Believe it. Don't be like, oh no, I'm going to write a letter. Like, don't do it. You know, let it pass, or write your letter, put it in the fridge or something, and then come back a day later and read it again and have
Who
a word.
puts letters in the fridge?
Just let it cool off. And then, just maybe scrunch it up and eat it. I don't know. But yeah, so I think what it comes down to is what kind of relationship you have with the business, and also what you want to get out of it. Is it just that you're mad and you want to complain? Because if so, it's the worst possible time to send feedback. Are they asking you for the feedback? Is this a consistent problem where you're able to send them constructive feedback and maybe some examples or pictures of a problem that you're having? So for me, it really comes down to, what do you want to get out of it? Is this something that you actually think will help? And I think taking that second to really, really think about, am I just angry? Like, is that what I'm feeling just now? Because if it is, it's the worst time to do inter-business communications, I think. And then there are companies that are actively like, give us feedback. Tell us what the problem is. Tell us what difficulties you're having. So there really is just a range of what businesses want from you as well. You know, I've done work with businesses extensively in terms of giving product feedback, and I do that because I am honest. I'm not going to lie and tell someone I think something is better than what it is, and I think that's what gives any opinion value. And I know that you've done work with companies directly as well, like really seeing samples, being sent prototypes, things of that nature, and giving a real honest opinion. That's important, but it's about when it's asked, when it's requested from you, I think. And if it's a problem that you're having with a company, being able to lay out what the issue is, what you would like to see happen in as a professional a way as possible is a better idea than writing an angry letter.
Yeah, I think at this point, like if we're breaking it down into smaller companies, larger companies, sometimes that can be a little bit of an oversimplification, because there are companies that I would consider to be one of the large companies, and they can be the most receptive to input. And like, it doesn't always have to be companies that you're spending tens of thousands of dollars a year with. Sometimes it can be companies that you're not even ordering from at all, but you might just have a personable relationship with somebody that works on staff and that's open to that kind of input. Like, there have been companies where maybe I'll make a big order once a year or like a few times here and there, but I can always just chat with them and I can say, hey, have you thought about maybe this small tweak, because I think it would be really beneficial, maybe not just for me, but for other piercers, for other people that are wearing this jewelry. Some of the larger companies have grown so large that they have departments within departments within departments, and it can be really difficult to get your comment from your piercer brain to the people who are designing the jewelry, who are making the jewelry, who are selling the jewelry, all these different things. So something that can be helpful if you feel like a company is large enough to the point where you don't know how to give them your input, let your money do the talking for you. I think a lot of these companies have have seen shifts in business. Companies kind of losing their business to other vendors, other suppliers has really been a big inspiration to them. There have been loads of companies where they were my staple, my main company, and then someone else came along who was starting to do it a little bit better or a little bit more affordable without dropping the quality, things like that. And then your business can shift to this other company and it can kind of re-inspire, it can light a fire under the butt of the original company. And then they can kind of think like, well, how can we do this in a more cost-productive way without cutting quality, without making a worse product? How can we maybe potentially make a better product with even maybe a more cost-effective price point? All these different things can happen, and I've seen them happen. You don't have to feel voiceless because like your voice can be your money, and you can take your voice and you can bring it to another company, and then maybe the other companies will start to think like, well, why are we losing business to these maybe upstart companies or these other companies that we see as competitors? What can we do to get back some of that market share? So that can be effective too. It's maybe a little bit longer of a timeline for that kind of change.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point that, deciding to take the budget that you have, the money that you have, and invest it somewhere else, that also speaks volumes. So in my opinion, another element to consider with this is we are clients to these jewelry companies, right? And as piercers, we have clients ourselves. So it's not a relationship that we're unfamiliar with. And I would say that there's a manner in which a client could speak to you that would make you think, go fuck yourself. Like there's a manner in which a client could address you that would make you think, I don't want to work with you anymore. And sometimes we do forget that the relationship that we have with jewelry companies, it is a client relationship. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't give feedback or complain when you're not happy with something. But imagine if you're just sitting at home in an evening and a client blasts about you all over Facebook about how unhappy they are about something and how they're really disappointed in you. Your first reaction would be defensiveness. Your first reaction would be, why didn't you email me? Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you come in? Like, why are you choosing this option? But that is also the way that a lot of us piercers can react to jewelry companies sometimes. We take it to Facebook. If we send an email or a message or we're not replied to straight away, we take it to Facebook. And sometimes I just think it's worth keeping in mind that like there is a vendor-client relationship going on here, just like the same as there is at work. And we should probably be addressing the businesses that we're dealing with in a way that's comparable to how we would like a client to address us if there was an issue. We don't always do that. We're all kind of growing up in the industry. Most of us have come into the industry not from any kind of formal business background, and sometimes we do get it wrong. I've gotten it wrong. Sometimes jewelry companies have also gotten it wrong. So I think that, like you say, it always does come back to communication and the intent behind the communication. What did you want to happen when you made the comment you made,
Yeah. Just to talk about a few, not exactly hypothetical scenarios, but I think scenarios that a lot of piercers might be able to relate to. I would say that with the kind of explosion of gold jewelry over the last 5 to 10 years, there's also been an explosion with goldsmith crafters, people making gold body jewelry. And I think it can be a really common issue when a new gold company launches, when a new gold company maybe comes to conference or starts putting out their stuff on social media. It might look really nice, but I think a big issue is, well, okay, but I want to see the pins. I want to see the pin on the back of it. And that can be a big weakness for a lot of new companies because they might just be like making something and focusing on a casting, a gem setting, polish, things like that, but their pin might not be excellent. And I've seen that happen with several companies where they put out great looking jewelry with a non-excellent pin. So that can be one of those perfect scenarios where the feedback, the input might really help that company. Like as a good example, and like you can tell me if it's appropriate to single them out, but like Juniper as an example, when they launched, they'll probably agree with it too. Like their pins were a little bit iffy, but through listening to input from the community, they updated their pins, they changed their pins, and now I think they have like excellent pins. I've seen all kinds of other companies, like even like larger companies, like a company like BVLA as example. They've started doing those new unicorn pins, which I definitely think are a big improvement over their previous generations of pins. Different companies have come along with huge innovations about steel pins and all different kinds of like attachment points. And I think a big reason why that evolution has happened was constructive criticism and welcomed input and feedback from the community of body piercers that are using their jewelry. So that can be one good example. Like if a company isn't receptive to that kind of input, they're going to have potentially more breakages. They're going to have more user errors. They're going to have more clients who are maybe unhappy with their jewelry falling apart, things like that. So giving input, giving constructive criticism can make all of those companies a lot stronger.
That's true. I mean, if you or I was working with a vendor and clients kept bringing their jewellery back and saying, this is broke, I need a repair or replacement for this, after a while, you would consider just dropping the vendor.
And I have.
And same.
Yeah.
And similarly, us as the clients for vendors, if a vendor keeps getting messages and emails saying, this keeps breaking, this is broke, every care was taken and this is still happening, eventually they're going to say, this is going to lose me business, I'm going to make some changes. But they do need that feedback from multiple sources to know this isn't just a piercer mishandling something, this is actually a problem with the product itself. So in that respect, having numerous sources of independent feedback can be really invaluable.
Yeah, some of the stuff that I've had to bring up to multiple companies over time, ring style jewelry or clicker style jewelry, just not having an appropriate wearing surface, like the scale of the wearing surface can be too small, or a seam can be just in like a slightly bad position that will be more likely to rotate into the piercing. So I've talked to loads of companies and I've said, hey, have you considered maybe this small tweak or that small tweak? Some of them, I've seen those updates roll into their product line and it's a lot better. The companies where I bring them feedback and I bring them input and I say like, I don't love it because of this, because it's making it actually like more difficult for the client to heal or less comfortable to wear, or it makes it unnecessarily difficult and challenging for me to be able to install it as a piercer. Some companies have made tweaks and changes, maybe not overnight. I think it's unrealistic to expect some of these changes to happen rapidly, but over time, I've seen a lot of improvements. And some companies, I haven't seen them be receptive to that input. So they are companies that I've moved on from because I really have to focus on making sure that my client stays happy. And some jewelry companies will look at it the same way. I have to keep my piercers happy, my studios happy to keep buying this jewelry. So there really is like a community aspect to some of this stuff. Is there anything else you want to get on that? Or
I feel like I've said as much as I possibly can without gravely damaging my business.
Yeah.
And this is another thing. Like there are times in our careers where we might butt heads with a company or even with another piercer or something like that. And I think like when you really get into it, when you really get into owning your own business, you have to let that stuff go. Like you have to just do whatever it is that's best for the company that you're trying to run, and try and leave like bruised egos and hurt feelings behind wherever you can, because they're not necessarily helpful to the day-to-day runnings of things. So yeah, I feel like we've kind of covered it as fully as we can. I think the main takeaway is don't be a dick. Try and think about how you like to receive feedback from clients who are unhappy. Think about the ways that it would be really hurtful or disrespectful for you to receive feedback, and try and avoid doing that to a company. And be prepared that they might tell you to fuck off and you might have to just get over it.
Is there anybody out there in podcast land who notices that I actively go out of my way to not swear on this show?
So do I. What are you trying to say?
Which one of us grew up in Scotland and which one didn't? Anyway, yeah, so, thank you. Everything should start with respect, and just try to keep this phrase in your mind. It's not personal, it's business. All right, so now we're going to move on to the next submitted question. Is that something you'd like to read?
Yeah, so the next question is gauges! Is there rhyme or reason why we use or don't use certain sizes for certain locations, when there's no set formula for what gauge to use where, what elements should we consider when selecting gauge size. Is there certain locations where we do not use certain gauges? For example, I never like to use 18 gauge in a insert location because it rarely succeeds.
So, I don't think that there is a formula.
I think there's a formula.
I think that a better way to phrase it is that piercers will develop a logic as to why they're using certain stuff. And some piercers will just use the stuff that's provided for them, or the stuff that their mentor showed them, or, you know, they read it in an article and it's like, okay, I saw that somebody used 14 gauge for a navel, so now I'm going to use 14 gauge for all navels for in all of time. I started out the same way. I started out with like, well, I don't know, what are other piercers using? And I'll just order that. Over time, I have created my logic where I can think like, what piercing gauge will give me the best healing result? And where I kind of am now in my career is just a little bit thicker, just a little tiny bit thicker, usually just like one size thicker than what might be like, air quotes, like standard sizing. So I could talk more about it as we get into it, but how would you like to start on this subject?
Well, I did a class on this called Size Matters a couple of years ago for UKPP, and it was one of my favorite classes that I've made.
It was a very good class.
Thank you. You're one of like 28 people in the whole world that saw it. 28 now expert sizing piercers. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it was a good class, I thought, and it was about the logic and rationale that goes into how I size things, how a lot of piercers size things. And I feel like it kind of pointed out some of the glaring errors that we make. And I'm going to give you an example. I got like a tiny little scale, and I measured various things in the studio. And I measured a common helix size for a librette that you would put in a helix, and then a gold end piece. And the gold end piece was 13 times heavier than the librette post. So in that instance, you have a front piece that's 13 times heavier than the post behind it. So you have something that's massively front heavy. Something like that is more likely to develop a pressure bump or pressure scar from tipping downwards. So there is a very real balancing act that we're playing here that's super relevant, and it's rarely going to be perfect, but trying to avoid those extremes of weight disparity I think is really, really useful for healing.
Yeah, like your class did a really good job of articulating something that I had as like a partially formed thought in my brain. And it was something along the lines of like, okay, imagine my entry to threadless jewelry was nostril piercings. And my backings for nostril piercings were tiny compared to what I'm using for cartilage piercings, ear cartilage, helix piercings, and other cartilage piercings today. So if I started out the majority of my threadless nostril piercings with an 18 gauge, probably 5/16 or 11/32 length, and probably one of those 2.5 millimeter tiny backings, not a big problem if the front piece was probably like a 2 or a 2.5 millimeter prong. The majority of the time, it can certainly vary from that quite a bit, but that's probably my most popular. That is a pretty decent balance. But when I started moving into like, okay, I want to use threadless jewelry for more ear stuff and, you know, helix piercings and conch piercings and whatever, there was a point earlier in my career where I couldn't afford to have 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 variations on threadless backings and sizes and styles. So it was like, okay, I'm still going to be probably using the same backs that I was using for nostril piercings. So when you take that same 18 gauge, 2.5 millimeter disc backing, you put that in a helix piercing with maybe like a 4 millimeter gem on the front. Yeah, it's going to be front heavy. It's going to tilt. It's going to be problematic. And sometimes you might develop the logic to think like, well, what can I do to have a better balance or to distribute pressure better or whatever? And sometimes you don't. And sometimes you just get frustrated at the problems and you're not really sure how to resolve them. So thinking through the logic for sizes, for balance, for like your concept for balance is really important. For me, like we can talk a little bit more about whatever you want for the balance subject, but I really want to talk about the thickness of the jewelry and how that's dispersing the pressure that might be on the piercing. And especially when we're talking about something like nipple piercings, I think would be an excellent example. But is there anything else you want to talk about with the balancing before I go off on a tangent about
I
nipple
have
gauge?
my own thoughts about gauges and the logic behind that. So,
Well, my main thing is, again, earlier in my career, I was just using the jewelry that I heard other people talk about using. And for a long time, it was all nipple piercings are going to be 14 gauge. And that's pretty much it. And a lot of times, like before a piercer moves into that maybe chapter of their career of internal thread jewelry and more focus on the jewelry quality and the variety of styles that you stock, things like that, sometimes it can go into that same safety position of like, well, what can I use this jewelry that I already have sitting around for? Like, what other piercings can I use it for? And for a long time, you'd only have like a very limited selection of jewelry. You would have like 14 gauge 3/4 inch barbells, and that would be like for every tongue, but also for like almost all of your nipples. So for a long portion of my early career, late 90s, early 2000s, all my nipple piercings were with 14 gauge. And there were other problems with them too. You know, the way that I was piercing it, the aftercare methods that I was using at the time were a little bit too harsh. But now I wouldn't want to use a 14 gauge on the majority of my nipple piercings because I think the jewelry is just thin enough where it disperses the pressure over a small surface area, which kind of creates like a pinchy sort of a pressure, especially for people that might have larger breasts and need to wear a bra or something for support, or might want to wear tight tops, or if they might want to sleep on their belly, or if they're very athletic. A small piece of jewelry will focus any sort of pressure from those things on a smaller surface area, and it can kind of pinch the piercing more. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been using 12 gauge for my minimum thickness for the majority of my nipple piercings, and I've seen a lot of those common irritations and problems just go away with just that one small difference. Going from 1.6 millimeter to 2 millimeter has made a world of difference for the comfort. I think there are other things that are ancillary, also, you know, the methods and the aftercare and all that other stuff that's made it easier to heal. But I think just going up that one gauge size has made a world of difference for the success rates on a lot of different piercings for me.
So when I think about how gauge affects healing, I think about it in a very specific way that makes sense to me, and I'll try and explain it. So as piercers, we think a lot about drainage, right? As a wound heals, it produces fluid. The fluid needs to come out of the piercing. When it doesn't, the piercing can become overly inflamed and blocked up, and then it can need to be upsized if it becomes embedded because it isn't draining properly. Like, this is a common problem that we can see with troubleshooting. Now, when it comes to selecting an appropriate size, I think of a 1/8, so that's an 18 gauge 5/16. To me, a 1/8 is the same size as a 2/16 because they have the same ratio. And that's what I think about in my head. Obviously, they're not the same size. What I mean is they're the same ratio to each other. And by that, I mean they're the same thickness to the same length. A 1 millimeter thick bar that's 8 millimeters long has the same ratio to a bar that's 2 millimeters thick and 16 millimeters long. It's the same shape, just blown up. So the proportions of the bar are the same. So the bar has the same proportions, whether it's like a forward helix done with a 1/8 or a nipple done at a 2/16, they have the same proportions to each other. And that's something that I like to consider when selecting my sizes and balancing out my work. Because if I was to take, let's say just for example, hopefully no one would ever do this, an 18 gauge bar that was 16 mil long. What's 16 mil? 5/8?
5/8.
An 18 gauge 5/16 bar and put it in a nipple, it's not going to be able to drain as effectively as a forward helix would because the channel is going to be proportionately longer and thinner and narrower because the liquid that it's going to be draining is going to be similar in consistency. Does that make any kind of sense?
I think it makes more sense when you have it in a class with the visual aids.
Yeah, I have pictures that I made.
Yeah, like I can picture it because I've seen the class, but I maybe would be a little bit worried that people just hearing the audio might not get it. But I think if you just say basically like, if you imagine piercing a nipple that needed 5/8 of an inch long jewelry and you were using 18 gauge, it's going to have a drainage problem because
Right.
it's going to be such a thin but such a long piercing. But my concern would also be the pressure elements of it.
So you're more worried about pressure, and I'm thinking about the aspect ratio of the piercings. But basically, yeah, and I think both of them are right. But in my mind, if anything is up at 16 mil, 18 mil, it should be 12. Like that makes sense because then it has the same ratio for fluid drainage as something that's 1.6 by 10 or 1 by 7. Like they're the same sizes, they're just blown up of each other.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what keeps them proportionate to the area that they're supporting, like you're saying.
You're a very smart person.
Not on
but
the podcast, it would seem.
You're a very smart person with visual aids.
I had diagrams.
They were really
They
good
don't
too.
translate to radio.
They were really good.
Yeah, I did them on my computer.
Well, they came out great.
Thank you.
I would be interested to talk to early generation jewelry designers, jewelry crafters, jewelry innovators, and I would be interested to know why they started off with certain sizes. Like there are going to be piercing pioneers, people like Eric Dakota, early jewelry manufacturer, people like Jim Ward, early piercing pioneer. My sneaking suspicion was that they had access to certain gauges of medical needles and they made jewelry to match the gauge of the needles, rather than thinking what's the ideal jewelry size and now let's try to find needles. Because like I don't think that 12 gauge medical needles were very common in the late 70s, early 80s, but 14 gauge needles were. So that's my suspicion of why certain things like, navels and tongues and nipples and all kinds of stuff were more commonly done with 14 gauge. So that's going to be my sneaking suspicion. But now in an age where we're all spoiled, we have access to so many different variations on jewelry and needles and all kinds of stuff. And if somebody's not already making what we want, we might be able to talk to a company and tell them like, this is what I want. Can you make it? So now we're spoiled for choice. So we have this privilege of being able to develop all this like snooty logic and think about all these theories and classes and stuff. But I think the early piercing pioneers were a lot more limited by what they had available. Maybe it was the wire stock, maybe it was the needles, maybe it was whatever else. But I don't think that we should just kind of constantly do the same thing generation after generation after generation. I think it is okay to maybe question previous generations and think like, okay, but why did you do it that way? Like it might have worked okay, but maybe it could work a little bit better if we evolve some of these concepts. And gauge size is definitely going to be one of my evolutions that I've done over my career. Your class was really good, by the way.
Thank you. I did a drawing. I'm going to describe the drawing. Okay.
No, I'm going to cut you off right there because you're still describing it in an audio format. How about this? How about we do your sizing class as a webinar again later this year?
Has this whole podcast been a ploy to try and get me to do something I don't want to do?
And you can sign up to watch my new paired tongue piercing video at patreon.com/RyanPBA. Is there anything else you wanna talk about?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know what the sizes are in American sizing, but you know how a lot of people use like 6s, 8s, and 10s, so like 1/4 inch, 5/16, 3/8.
Yeah.
I am all about the 7s, 9s, and 11s, and I don't know why they're treated like second-class sizes because I love those sizes.
I can tell you why.
And I want all companies to be making 7s and 9s and 11s because sometimes the other ones are just wrong.
Let me tell you why.
I like them even more. I'm the odd size
You'd have to
person.
stop talking for me to tell you.
I know.
So, okay, I think really what it was is price accessibility. I think a lot of companies, when they started manufacturing, they had to kind of think like, well, okay, we can't make everything in every increment. We can't make like every millimeter and a half, fractions of millimeters, all these different things. So I think they created what was basically standard sizing based on empirical sizing.
I'm saying they got it wrong. They should drop the 6, 8, and 10 and instead do the 7, 9, 11.
If you give me a second, you'll realize that I'm
No.
agreeing with your point, because like I love to use all of those like in between increments, and I know that some people go kind of insane when you call them like half sizes, because like they're really not half sizes. But if you look at it in the way where the full empirical sizes, 1/4 inch, 5/16, 3/8 of an inch, 7/16, half inch, all of that stuff, yes, you're skipping basically 2 millimeters with each one. So I think in markets where millimeters are going to be the standard of measure, meaning the entire rest of the world, that's not America, I think that those size increments will be a lot more commonplace. But now it seems like just about every company is doing those 1 millimeter size increments. Pretty much all of the threadless and threaded companies that I work with, at least, offer those sizes. And it wasn't always the case. For a long time, it was like, well, okay, 1/4 inch is a little bit too short, but 5/16 is a little bit too long. Can you make something in between? And sometimes their answer would be like, well, we just don't have enough call for that. There isn't enough market for that, because these jewelry companies, like, to bring it back to maybe the criticism element of it, these small little criticisms that piercers might think of, like, oh, well, how hard can it be? Sometimes it might involve like massive retooling. If we're talking about like machine companies, there might be a bunch of CAD work involved, or like changing molds or castings. And some of these things that might seem like, oh, it's so small and so simple to a body piercer, could potentially be thousands or tens of thousands of dollars of investment for the manufacturers. So if they don't see a market where they can recoup their investment to earn tens of thousands of dollars in sales from these different like small size increments, they're not going to prioritize it. So I think now we are in a point where the piercing world, the piercing market is so large that you will have this gigantic range of options that are available to you. And I think it will only grow. So I think we should all be trying to grow together. I think piercers should be trying to learn and evolve their craft. I think that they should be sharing what they learn and evolve with jewelry manufacturers. And I think jewelry manufacturers should try to maybe involve piercers a little bit more to stay ahead of the curve for some of these innovations and changes. And a big motivator would be like, if you're the first person to make it, you can be the first person to sell it and profit off of it too. So I think it can be a win-win for everybody. How are we going to wind down this episode?
I'm not sure. We could just keep recording forever.
Just forever? Well, I have like 5 hours and 14 minutes of space left on this memory card.
We could rewatch Phantom of the Opera.
No, I do not want to rewatch Phantom of the Opera.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
Fun.
It was pretty okay.
Yeah, my favorite bit is how
No. We're going to lose everybody. They're just going to turn off the episode.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to yet another episode of the Piercing Wizard podcast. Just squeezed this one in under the wire and making it available to you before the end of February, so I can try to stick with my pledge of trying to do an episode every month. But just made it. We're going to be back with more episodes sometime. I would imagine we're going to do one in March. But I don't know what subject it will be. So if you're interested in those classes, again, I have Sunday, March 16th, 2025, just outside of Montreal in Quebec, Canada. And I have an online webinar all about bevel theory on Sunday, March 23rd. You can get all the info and you can sign up for either of those classes at ryanpba.com. What would you like to say?
I have no events coming up apart from my birthday. It is going to be my birthday.
Happy birthday.
That will be coming up.
Well, happy birthday. Let me be the first to say it.
Thank you. It's about time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
For more information about the show, visit piercingwizardpodcast.com or like Piercing Wizard Podcast on Facebook. For more info about your host, visit precisionbodyarts.com or search Ryan PBA on Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr. If you enjoy the show, you can subscribe on iTunes, Apple Podcast, and Google Play. Music by Benny B. Blanco. Show copyright 2017, Precision Body Arts LLC, all rights reserved.